Thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. Nothing like this has ever happened before. Almost-ish. There was that one other time.
Today, a limousine brought former Attorney General John Mitchell to court. They used to call him the Big Enchilada at the White House. He came to be sentenced as a convicted felon. For 64 days, these men sat in Judge Sirica's courtroom. When the time came for a final statement, Mitchell and his lawyer had nothing to say. All eyes were on the man who is known as Maximum John. The judge wasted no time on a speech. Mitchell, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman each must serve at least 2.5 years in prison, maybe as long as 8 years. Judge Sirica would not comment on the case as he left the courthouse. John Mitchell left, growling, "It could have been worse. He could have sentenced me to spend the rest of my life with Martha Mitchell."
Could have been worse. Could have sentenced me to spend the rest of my life with Martha Mitchell, my wife, my ex-wife. John Mitchell was Richard Nixon's presidential campaign manager when Nixon won the presidency in '68. John Mitchell's marriage to Martha Mitchell had broken up in 1973 in the midst of the Watergate scandal. And the year after that, of course, in 1974, Nixon resigned in scandal. He at least was pardoned for his own Watergate-related crimes. But the following year, 1975, when Nixon campaign manager and ex-U.S. Attorney General John Mitchell was sentenced for his own crimes in the Watergate scandal, and he was sentenced for conspiracy and obstruction of justice and perjury and lying to investigators, his only comment to the press upon getting his federal prison sentence handed down was that at least he wouldn't have to spend any more time with his darn wife. Sure, I'm going to prison, but could be worse. You know, every generation thinks it invents the newest and worst kinds of scoundrels and scumbags in public life. Honestly, history gave us some good ones too. Do not give history short shrift, even on historic days like this. Today, for the very first time, it was the sitting president of the United States whose campaign chair was sentenced to federal prison. John Mitchell, at least, didn't get his sentence until Nixon was out of office and was a former president. John Mitchell was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison back in 1975. Mitchell ended up getting released from prison after serving 19 months because of poor health. Today, it was President Trump's campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, and he beat Mitchell's record today, because he was given a much longer sentence than Mitchell was. Manafort today was sentenced to 47 months, just shy of 4 years in federal prison. Now, there's no parole in the federal prison system anymore, so even though we don't know exactly how long Manafort will serve on this sentence, you can sort of do a little bit of the math in your head. You can start at 47 months, which is what he got today. You should then subtract 9 months credit. They're apparently giving him credit for the time he's already served in the Alexandria Federal Detention Center while he's been on trial and awaiting this sentencing today. Then maybe, I think you can subtract a little bit of good time credit for that. If you do that math, again, back of the envelope, and you never know how these things are go, but it's maybe a ballpark figure of 3 years of real time that he will serve on this sentence-ish. We will get some expert advice on that later on this hour. But this is a remarkable thing. I mean, this is history. It's the campaign chairman for the sitting president of the United States going to federal prison for years for multiple felonies, only halfway through that president's term in office. Paul Manafort was the first indictment announced by special counsel Robert Mueller back in 2017. Manafort was originally charged alongside his deputy campaign chair from the Trump campaign, Rick Gates. The two of them appeared from the outset to have linked fates, both in terms of what they were charged with and in terms of how their cases would proceed through the criminal justice system. They appeared to be peas in a pod until Gates bailed. Gates decided to plead guilty and become a cooperating witness, working with the prosecution in their case against his former boss, Paul Manafort, and working with them on other ongoing investigations as well. And now Manafort's case is coming to an end. Manafort is learning how much time he will spend in prison. Meanwhile, Rick Gates's cooperation with prosecutors continues. Gates doesn't yet have his own sentencing date. But his life is very different than Paul Manafort since he pled guilty. I mean, unlike Manafort, Rick Gates has been at home all this time. He hasn't been in jail even for a day, although there is still the prospect that that's where he's heading when his cooperation is fully over and he's finally sentenced. The convictions for which Paul Manafort was sentenced today were the only jury verdicts thus far in any case brought by special counsel Robert Mueller or in any derivative prosecution that's related to any of these scandals. It's the only jury verdict. Everybody else has pled and is either awaiting sentencing or they've already been sentenced by a judge. Nobody else has yet faced a trial other than Paul Manafort. And at his trial this summer, you will recall that Paul Manafort didn't take the stand in his own defense. There was tons of testimony against him from, among others, Rick Gates, his former deputy, also from accountants and bookkeepers who testified about Manafort's crimes. In the end, that jury in Virginia convicted Manafort on 5 felony counts of tax fraud, 2 felony counts of bank fraud, and 1 felony count related to him not reporting his foreign bank accounts. And the best news that Manafort got that day was that despite the fact that that jury in Virginia convicted him of 8 felonies, as John Mitchell might say, it could have been worse that day. Because Paul Manafort that day was actually facing 18 felony charges at that trial. Remember, of the 12 jurors in the Manafort trial, there was just 1 holdout. 11 jurors wanted to convict him on all 18 felonies, but 1 juror held out and said no on 10 of them. And it's been a little weird to figure that out ever since. I mean, that 1 juror went along with his or her fellow jurors on the other 8 counts. There did not seem to be any difference in the amount of evidence put forward on those 10 counts where the juror held out versus the other 8 counts where the juror went along. But nevertheless, that's how it went. Juries are juries. They can do what they want. And so Paul Manafort came out of that trial, lucky guy, with 8 felony convictions to his name. And when a jury can't come to a unanimous decision, that's called a hung jury. So he got a hung jury on those 10 felony counts. And on those 10 felony counts where there was a hung jury, the prosecutors from Mueller's office, they initially reserved the right to try Paul Manafort again for those 10 charges. You can do that in the case of a hung jury. It's very interesting to me, and I've never quite understood the strategy behind this. Mueller's prosecutors initially reserved the right to bring Manafort up on those 10 charges where he had the hung jury again, if they decided they wanted to. But they never went through with that decision. They never tried him again on those 10 felonies on which there was a hung jury. But they did make sure that when Manafort later pled guilty in a different federal court in D.C., his guilty plea in that other court included him explicitly confessing that, yeah, maybe he wasn't convicted on those 10 other felony charges where there was that 1 juror who was the holdout. Yeah, maybe he hadn't been convicted on those 10 felonies, but Manafort confessed in his plea deal that actually he was guilty of those 10 felony charges too. Why didn't they charge him with those again? Why have him admit that he committed those crimes later on in a different proceeding while also giving up your right to bring him up on those charges again? But that was just one of the amazing curveballs in this case. So Manafort pleads not guilty to 18 felonies in Virginia. He goes to trial. The jury squashes him. Guilty, 8 felony counts. The other 10 felonies are like floating around out there for a while until on the eve of his next trial, where he was going to be tried for another 7 felonies, this time in D.C., he surprises everybody, right? He does what appears at the outset to be this U-turn. And he admits guilt to those 10 charges on which there had been a hung jury in Virginia. He pleads guilty to 2 conspiracy charges. Prosecutors agree to drop all of the other felony charges against him. And he says that he is going to become a cooperating witness, right? And that, part of that plea, so he pleads guilty. He says he's going to become a cooperator. They drop all the other charges. He admits that he was guilty in those 10 felonies they didn't bring him up on trial again for. Right? And they could have potentially been brought against him in trial again. That was supposed to be the start of a whole new Paul Manafort, right? Coming clean, pleading guilty, admitting guilt to the 10 charges on which they didn't retry him. Right? At that moment, when he decided to plead and become a cooperator, that was him, as the prosecutors say, that was him joining Team USA. That first trial, yeah, guilty on 8 counts. But before he even got to that second trial, no, it's a whole new Paul Manafort. He's joining Team USA, joining with prosecutors, admitting his guilt. It turns out it didn't work out that way, right? The cooperation aspect of Manafort's case is another fascinating curveball. I mean, before tonight, prosecutors had never given any substantive public account as to what Manafort might have given them as a cooperator, as to how helpful he was as a cooperating witness. Today in court, the special counsel's office was as blunt as they have been on that subject ever. Tonight in federal court, they told the judge in Virginia that Manafort, quote, did not provide valuable information to the special counsel. After Manafort's defense team tried to raise in court this issue of him having spent tons of hours in meetings with the special counsel, they were trying to get him credit for that from the judge. Prosecutors told the judge tonight that the number of hours Paul Manafort spent with the special counsel, quote, that number is not reflective of the value of the information we received. Quote, he told us 50 hours of things we already knew. He did not provide us information that was useful. So that's important from the prosecutor's perspective, right? Because it means they didn't want this judge to give Manafort any credit for cooperating because cooperation was useless. He gave them information they already had and he lied to them. No matter how much time his defense team can say he spent with the prosecutors found him worse than useless. So that's interesting in terms of informing the judge's decision tonight in terms of how much time to give Manafort. But for us, watching from the outside, trying to figure out how the Manafort case fits into the larger scandal here and into potential other cases against other people, that was also a signal from the special counsel's office that there was no way they'd be relying on Paul Manafort as any kind of witness against anyone. I mean, once you're telling the judge bluntly, hey, this guy repeatedly lies even to prosecutors who he's supposed to be helping, that makes him useless as a potential witness against anyone else in any other case. And you'll remember, during Manafort's trial in Virginia, the judge there, the sort of famously cantankerous judge, he basically yelled at the prosecutors in court, right? It was this big dramatic moment in court. In a hearing before the trial started, the judge said in open court, you don't really care about Mr. Manafort's bank fraud. You really care about getting information Mr. Manafort can give you that would reflect on Mr. Trump and lead to his prosecution or impeachment. The judge had said that in open court. You don't care about Manafort. You're only using him to get his testimony, to get evidence and information he can give you to get bigger fish, to go get the president. And he sort of reamed the prosecutors out for that, scolded them, almost sort of mocked them in the court because he could tell that was their real intent. Well, the prosecutors fundamentally rebutted that, right? They rebutted that outburst from the judge tonight when they came to him at Paul Manafort's sentencing and said, nah, this guy, we can't use him for anything. We can't use him against anyone. We can't use him for any other case. All he does is lie. He's pointless as a witness. He's of no help. This case is just about his crimes, and that's it. This judge, though, Judge T.S. Ellis in Virginia, he was super aggressive with the prosecutors throughout the Manafort proceedings. Today, when it came time to sentence Manafort, the ball was completely in that judge's court. Judges have freedom when it comes to sentencing in federal court. The sentencing guidelines spelled out that Manafort should get 19 to 24 years in prison, but those guidelines are merely a guide. Judges are free to depart from those guidelines in either direction as far as they want to. The only thing a judge can't do is exceed the statutory minimum sentence defined by law for the crimes for which Manafort was convicted. When it came time to decide tonight how much time Manafort would actually spend in prison, the judge went way below that sentencing guidelines range. He didn't go 19 to 24 years. He gave him a little less than 4 years. And he took time to criticize those sentencing guidelines in open court. The judge said tonight, quote, these guidelines are quite high. He said, quote, I think this sentencing range is excessive. Paul Manafort has already spent 9 months in that federal lockup in Virginia. You'll remember he ended up in jail when he had his bail revoked because prosecutors said they caught him witness tampering while he was out on bail. So he had to go to a federal lockup awaiting trial, and then during his trial and until today awaiting sentencing. Since he's been in jail all this time, all these 9 months, his defense team told the court today that he's really fallen apart physically. Manafort's defense team told the court today that Manafort now has severe gout, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, psoriasis, arthritis, unspecified thyroid trouble, anxiety, panic attacks, and claustrophobia. And he will apparently get credit against his sentence. This 4-year sentence that he got, he'll get credit against that sentence for the 9 months that he's already served in that federal lockup. But his fate at this point really is still an open question. Manafort's next stop will be the federal courthouse in D.C. He is due to be sentenced in D.C. next Wednesday for more felonies, for those 2 felonies that he pled guilty to. And that will be a whole different judge who has been through a whole different proceeding with him. For that sentencing next week, the maximum sentence that D.C. judge would be allowed to hand down would be 10 years. But that judge next week now has the benefit of knowing what Manafort's sentence was in this other court tonight. So that D.C. judge next week, Judge Amy Berman Jackson, she'll not only be deciding on her own terms, on the basis of the felony charges before her, how much time in prison Paul Manafort should get. She will also be deciding whether the time she gives should run concurrently with this other sentence he got tonight, or whether it will be consecutive. She could give him up to 10 years. Let's say she gives him 5 years. If they run concurrently, that means he'll run both of those sentences at the same time, right? He'll start both of those sentences day one. He'll end up serving a total of 5 years in prison because the 4-year sentence and the 5-year sentence will run at the same time. But judges, if they want to be harsher, they have the ability to sentence you to serve your other sentence first. Right? And then when you're done with that one, you can start this next sentence that I'm going to give you. You can start this next sentence thereafter. If that happened, theoretically, with the 4 years he got in Virginia tonight, let's say he got 5 years next week in D.C., that would mean that he'd be looking at 9-year sentence in total. If the judge next week completely throws the book at Manafort, that would be a 10-year sentence from that D.C. judge next week. If she gives him the maximum that she could give him, 10 years, and she has it run consecutively, not concurrently, that means the total maximum Manafort could be looking at would be just under 14 years in federal prison. Now, to be clear, he could get anything under that, including no additional time beyond the sentence that he got tonight. But the max prison time he could be looking at now, again, just shy of 14 years. So, historic day. We've got this one bottom line, right? The presidential campaign chairman for the sitting president of the United States just got a 4-year federal prison sentence. But another shoe is about to drop for that campaign chair in the next few days. That will make all the difference in terms of his ultimate fate. When Manafort's defense lawyer was asked outside the courthouse tonight if he thought this 4-year prison sentence was fair for his client, Manafort's lawyer wouldn't even answer that. He said he wouldn't know the answer to that until they get the other sentence too.
How are you feeling about the sentencing next week in Washington?
We look forward to it.
Do you think the sentence today was fair for Manafort?
I'll let him speak to that after we're done in D.C.
Do you have any comments on the sentence that was handed down?
No.
Have any comment on the sentence that was handed down? No. So, for Paul Manafort, one sentence down, another to come in less than a week. I have lots of questions about all of these things, including what it was like in the court while all this was happening today. But before we bring in some folks to try to answer some of those questions, let me just interject one last thing into this conversation and into this story before we bring in people who actually know these things and can give us some perspective here. Here's the one last thing. And it's actually the other thing Paul Manafort's defense lawyer said tonight on the courthouse steps after this sentencing. And it was, I guess it shouldn't be a surprise to me at this point, but it was a surprise when he got up there and said, no collusion, no collusion, no collusion.
Good evening, everyone. As you heard in court today, Mr. Manafort finally got to speak for himself. He made clear he accepts responsibility for his conduct. And I think most importantly, what you saw today is the same thing that we had said from day one. There is absolutely no evidence that Paul Manafort was involved with any collusion with any government official from Russia. Thank you, everybody.
What do you think of the sentence?
Was he involved with collusion with anybody else in Russia who wasn't a government official? I mean, but also, why even bring that up? And why is that the most important thing? I think most important, what you saw today, is that the most important thing? I mean, not only was Manafort not charged with anything having to do with Russia in this case for which he was just sentenced, this was the trial where Judge Ellis actually banned any discussion of Russia collusion at all in his courtroom. So nobody could have tried to prove anything like that against Manafort in this trial in Virginia, even if they had wanted to. And these no collusion public arguments from the Manafort defense team, which we have been seeing increasingly from them in public filings and now today on the courthouse steps as Manafort has come to the end of his rope. These no collusion arguments, they are absolutely outside the four corners of this case in Virginia. So why do they keep bringing that up? And why would that be the most important part about this case where the judge ruled that that could never be discussed in this case? Why keep going back to that issue? Especially when there are, in fact, collusion questions that remain about Paul Manafort's case. You might remember there was an accidentally unredacted filing that Paul Manafort's defense team submitted in D.C. a few weeks ago. And in that accidentally unredacted filing, we learned that one of the things Manafort lied to prosecutors about when he was supposed to be cooperating with them was the number of meetings he'd had with a Russian guy who prosecutors say is linked to Russian intelligence. Specifically, Manafort also lied to prosecutors about providing Trump campaign polling data to that Russian guy who prosecutors say is linked to Russian intelligence. Right? That was all supposed to be under seal, but it accidentally peeked out because they screwed up one of their redactions. And even though we have never seen charges on that subject, right? We have never seen any criminal charges about the Trump campaign giving internal secret polling data to Russian intelligence as, as potentially related to Russian intelligence interfering in the election. I mean, that reference in Manafort's case and the fact that it was supposed to stay redacted, it does raise questions about Manafort's involvement with Russian intelligence during the campaign. As the New York Times nutted it up today, quote, the special counsel's office had wanted that information kept out of the public eye to protect an open investigation. What open investigation? Quote, it remains unclear why Mr. Kilimnik would want such polling data. Also, it remains unclear what exactly he did with it and whether the data transfer might have helped inform the Russian government's covert operation to interfere with the American election. So that's, Manafort's fate still to be settled in terms of next week's sentence. But in terms of the story here, and in terms of the scandal, and in terms of how Manafort fits into all of this, the one big dangling thread here is not what can Manafort tell prosecutors about the president or about anybody else. They're not interested in anything he has to say. They think he's a liar. They don't think he's useful. The big dangling thread here, with Manafort now learning his fate, right? Next time we'll know if he'll be spending even more time in prison than he was just sentenced to tonight. With Manafort's fate becoming clear and his case ending, there is this thread. There are uncharged allegations described in the Manafort case about alleged contacts and the provision of secret data from the highest ranks of the Trump campaign to Russian intelligence while Russian intelligence was interfering in the election to try to help Trump win. Prosecutors told the judge in Manafort's case in D.C. that allegation is that thing that he lied to prosecutors about. It goes to the heart of what the special counsel is investigating. But those charges are clearly not being adjudicated against Paul Manafort. We know that now. His case is coming to an end in 2 federal jurisdictions. So why is the government redacting that allegation in his case? Why is the government trying to keep all references to those allegations under seal in his case? The government says they wanted those redactions from those documents in order to protect ongoing investigations. What ongoing investigations? If they're not using those allegations in their case against Paul Manafort, where are they using those allegations? In what case? Against who? Joining us now is Josh Gerstein, senior legal affairs contributor for Politico.com. He had a long day in the courtroom today. Mr. Gerstein, thank you very much for being here tonight.
Hey, Rachel, my pleasure.
Let me just ask, big picture, what did you think of this sentencing hearing today and the behavior of the judge, the behavior of the defendant, Mr. Manafort? What was your biggest impression?
Well, the top line, of course, is the takeaway of it being just a 47-month sentence. I would say the consensus of most of the people I was sitting amongst in the room, lawyers, observers, journalists, was that we would see a sentence of somewhere between 7 to 10 or 12 years. maybe not up in that guidelines range of 20 to 24 years, but a substantial sentence nonetheless. So 4 is a lot lighter. 4 years a lot lighter than many people were expecting. Another thing that struck me was the lack of any public contrition from Paul Manafort. His statement was very brief. We were in the courtroom for about 3 hours altogether today, and his statement amounted to 4 minutes. The strongest thing he said was that he recognizes that it's his conduct that has brought him here. But there was no regret, really, certainly no remorse, and no kind of granular description of any of the things he'd done wrong, or that he intended to break the law, or he recognized the severity of what he'd done. So it was mostly a statement, thanking his family, praising the judge. He must have done that on, I think, 3 different occasions, and sort of apologizing for the trauma that his friends and loved ones had experienced, but very little introspection beyond that. And then the final thing I really took away, Rachel, was that this judge continues to have deep reservations about Mueller's operation. He said at one point, he sort of snapped, "We all know why we're here." And one prosecutor at one point said the government's position on this is that we don't recommend, he said the special counsel's position on this is we don't recommend specific sentences for specific defendants. And the judge snapped, "Don't say special counsel's office, say the government's position. You're talking about the government." So it seemed like Judge Ellis still has an issue with special counsels generally, and maybe Mueller specifically. And the degree to which that may have colored the sentence that he delivered today, I don't know. He insisted that it didn't, but it's obviously a lighter sentence than many people expected.
Well, to that point, in terms of him insisting that that wasn't a factor for him, a whole bunch of people who have argued trials in this courtroom, who have observed this judge over the course of his 3 decades on the bench, told us to expect that any allocution today from Manafort would be important, that it's very important to this judge that people do accept responsibility, that they do express regret, that they do appear to be sincerely remorseful. That's like the notes that we were taking into today's hearing today, watching for that from Manafort. For Manafort to then not provide that, to not give the judge any of that, and the judge to nevertheless give him this big downward departure from the guidelines. Did the judge give any indication of why he was giving such a lighter sentence than the guidelines would have suggested he might have?
Well, the judge did say he was surprised that Manafort didn't make a more remorseful statement or more regretful statement, or even acknowledge that he was wrong to have broken the law. But then the very next thing the judge said was that that's not going to affect my decision here today. The best explanation he gave about why he was going way below the guidelines was that he felt that they're out of whack compared with the way people are generally sentenced in cases that involve primarily tax evasion and not reporting your foreign bank accounts. He said a typical sentence in cases such as that is usually somewhere in the range of 6 months to a year. Many of them result in probation only. This particular judge had a case about a year or two ago where somebody had hidden $220 million overseas and stashed, I think, avoided about $18 million in taxes, and got something only on the order of a 7-month prison sentence. So it seemed like Judge Ellis felt that Manafort's case was maybe a little more severe than a garden variety tax evasion case, but he wasn't buying the notion that this was an incredibly dangerous scheme that really needed to be punished with an extraordinarily long sentence.
Josh Gerstein, senior legal affairs contributor for Politico. Josh, can I book you right now to go to the D.C. sentencing next week? Are you busy?
I'm planning to be there with bells on.
All right, I'll talk to you. If not
Thanks,
before
Rachel.
then, I'll talk to you then. Thanks, Josh.
Okay.
All right, former U.S. Attorney Barb McQuade was in court for most of the Manafort trial. She's going to join us next. We've got a lot more still to get to tonight. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.